My name is Lika Heifetz. I am a professor of epidemiology at UCLA, and I wanted to tell you first a little bit about me. I have more than 30 years in non-ionizing research. I worked at EPRI, which has been mentioned several times before. EPRI is a nonprofit institute funded by utilities and other organizations. And without EPRI research, much of the research wouldn't be done. So people here called for waiting until we know more. That would be contradictory because without EPRI research, we would not know more. So I've also taught at Stanford. I worked at World Health Organization, where I was in charge of their radiation program, and now I am at UCLA. I have over 135 peer-reviewed publications, many of which have been quoted and referenced in all the reports that you've heard about today, such as IARC, WHO, and even the Bioinitiative report. I have more than 18 book chapters and lots of other publications, such as by National Academy of Science reports that I participated in. In addition, I have been on numerous reviews and advisory committees to various governments. This is just a sample. This includes National Academy of Sciences, a project that looks at non-ionizing radiation by European Union, by reviews by World Health Organizations, which I edited and co-authored many chapters in, International Labor Organization, International Agency for Research on Cancer, which has been brought up several times. I've participated in their reviews as well. National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, Independent Advisory Committee to Swedish Government, and International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, which is the international organization that establishes guidelines that is adopted in many, many countries. So I want you to look quickly at this electromagnetic spectrum. It's very broad. It goes from 0 hertz, which is a static field of the Earth, for example, to low frequency fields. And whenever we use any kind of equipment like this computer, electromagnetic fields are produced. Power lines, then we go to television and radio. We go to radio frequencies, and this is the concern mostly that you are focusing on. That includes television, radio and TV, cell phones, Wi-Fi, baby monitors, and smart meters. And then we go to visible light and ionizing radiation. And the health effects are very much frequency dependent. So you cannot talk about that in general terms. You have to be very specific because we know that ionizing radiation is a carcinogen, but we do not know that radio frequency field is a carcinogen. So it very much depends on the frequency, and there is a lot of confusion. This is a joke, but this is an example of a TV, a very large TV station, and they talk about non-iodizing radiation. That's, of course, they meant to say non-ionizing radiation, but they said non-ionizing. So confusion reigns everywhere. So I've been given a task to summarize for you radio frequency research that encompasses thousands of studies. So as you could imagine, I cannot go into the detail on all of them. I'm going to give you a very general information, and I've covered it in more details in my report. I should also mention that whatever studies have been brought in or discussed here, I am well aware of them, and all the major studies have been referenced or discussed in my report. So history of radio frequency research goes far back. In the 70s, there was a general investigation of biological parameters in the laboratory. I'm sorry, I wanted to say that please interrupt me. I welcome your questions. In early, first there was a focus on biological parameters, then there were some animal studies that were done that were focused on heating. Then in 1990s, there were other animal studies done on possible effects on brain, and there was an investigation, epidemiologic studies of incidence, for example, in childhood leukemia, in proximity to radio and TV transmitters. But mostly research started from 2000 on to the present. And my report and the presentation focuses on the most recent research. So epidemiologic studies were considered, which are considered most relevant to human health in any investigations or reviews, because they are most relevant to humans. There have been a large number of epidemiologic studies that focused on mobile phones. And the focus is on the brain cancer incidence because we hold the phones close to our brain. For base station, the focus has been on subjective systems, such as sleep problems and headaches. For TV and radio, focus was on childhood leukemia. There was some occupational studies, mostly in electronic and military, and the early video display operators and physiotherapists. The focus was on reproduction and development. So all of this literature was evaluated by IARC, which is International Agency for Research on Cancer, and is considered to be a premier organization to look at cancer, potentially cancer substances. IARC looks at human data or epidemiology separately, and then it looks at animal studies also separately and classifies them, and then combines those together, and it looks at laboratory studies as supporting. So here you can see that in IARC evaluation, which was in 2011 and was published in 2012, the epidemiologic studies were considered to be limited, which means that there is a positive association observed, but chance, bias, and confounding cannot be ruled out. And then the animal studies were also evaluated, and the evidence was also considered limited, and this was mostly because of evidence of co-exposure. So these two classifications are limited, are then put together, and the IARC classified radio frequencies fields as possibly carcinogenic. So possibly carcinogenic, about 1,000.
I'm sorry, did you say those studies were 2011, 2012?
Yeah, it was the meeting. So they hold a meeting for about a week in Lyon, France, and all the scientists, about 30 or 40 scientists, are sitting together and they discuss it and they write the reports, and then they come up with the conclusions, and then it takes another few months to a year to publish the actually large monograph. It's a large, like a book that they publish.
Are there more recent reports from the same group?
No, there is a discussion that this is a very expensive procedure that takes a long time, and the radio frequency fields have been nominated to be examined again maybe in 5 to 6 years. So this probably will take much more than that, but something in like 5 or 6 years, it might be evaluated again. So about 1,000 agents have been looked at by IARC, and here is just gives you a brief example. I'm sorry if you cannot see it well, but basically the highest category, there are about 100. This number is constantly changed as new agents are added or re-evaluation occurs, but gives you sort of an order of magnitude. So out of about 1,000 agents, 100 are classified as carcinogenic. And the examples include asbestos and ionizing radiation and smoking. Then about 60 or so studies are classified as probably carcinogenic, or 2A, and some, the example is diesel engine exhaust, for example. And then a large group, about 250, are classified as possibly carcinogenic, and that is where coffee is, for example, and radio frequency fields are also there. So that's 2B classification. And then about half is put into the categories not classifiable, meaning the information is not consistent enough to give it a classification, and then only one is considered probably not carcinogenic, and that's not because there are not lots of things that are not carcinogenic, but to be part of the process, there should be a lot of evidence, and then it goes through the process. So, so the focus of the IR classification, the real basis for it, were mobile phone studies, because those were the studies that were done. This is where the exposure is much higher to the head. So, but there are other exposures, like to the base stations and wireless technologies, which are much lower levels. And in fact, WHO has this fact sheet which is available, and they said, considering the very low exposure levels and research result collected to date, there is no convincing evidence that the weak radio frequency signals from base station and wireless networks cause adverse health effects.
That's as of 2006?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, but there is really, I mean, their opinion, they haven't published this is a fact sheet, this is not this big evaluation, but it hasn't been updated. If there was new data, this would be updated, because just an internal WHO document, it's not a large document like the manuscript or environmental health criteria or something.
Yes, I would say since 2006, there's been 3G, 4G.
I know, but it would only be updated if there was new data. Since it doesn't be updated, if they change their opinion, they would publish it. So they wouldn't publish it again.
So there's no new data since 2006?
No, there is new data, but it doesn't change their opinion.
And
Oh,
just
that's
clarify
interesting.
their opinion for us, as you've gone with this back and forth. Would you just reiterate what you said their opinion was?
So their opinion for the base stations, this is for lower exposure. This is like cell towers.
Okay.
So this is cell towers and other wireless technologies like Wi-Fi and that sort of thing, and smart meters. So this would be that they're saying that there is no, that because the signal is so weak, this is as opposite to mobile phones, that they consider there is no convincing scientific evidence that they cause adverse health effects. So another issue that has been brought up here, and so I go in a little bit more detail here, is the question of electromagnetic hypersensitivity. This is a condition that has lots and lots of ill-defined symptoms, like sleep disturbance, insomnia, headache, depression, tiredness, changes in memory, dizziness, lots and lots of things, and those are very similar to people who experience chemical sensitivity as well. So the electromagnetic hypersensitivity research is difficult to do for many reasons, because people have brought up some surveys that they asked people on the internet, do you have any symptoms associated with smart meters? And a lot of people wrote in saying, or very small percentage, but wrote in saying that yes, they've experienced all these symptoms. But there are many problems with that, as you can imagine, that they are based on self-report and participation, and nobody knows what are the rates of those diseases in the population. So was it more with smart meters or less with smart meters? It could be any way. And exposure is not assessed in those studies. This is just a self-reporting anecdotal studies. Several of those studies have been brought to your attention. Only one of them was published in a peer-reviewed publication, and I mentioned that one in my report as well. So there are also double-blind studies, meaning that the investigator and the subject don't know when they are exposed. And those are considered a more reliable studies. So people who think they are sensitive brought into a situation, and they cannot detect the signal. They think that they can detect when the meter is on or off, or the phone is on or off, but they really cannot reliably when it's done in an appropriate manner. However, there are problems with those studies as well, because the exposure is not tailored to participants, and some people claim that they're exposed to very specific signals. And, the blinding is a problem. There are also, and also only very short-term exposures could be studied in those studies. So you cannot, so if a person thinks that they're having an effect due to long-term exposure, you cannot have a laboratory experiment running forever. So it's usually a few hours or a day or so that people are exposed. So those studies can lead to both false positive and false negative results, but overall, it is clear that these people experience all kinds of symptoms, but that they are not related to their RF exposure, given the caveats that I just mentioned, but that those studies are hard to do. So WHO, again, has another fact sheet also from quite a while ago, where they say that EHS is characterized by a variety of non-specific symptoms that differ from individual to individual. The symptoms are certainly real and can vary widely in their severity. However, no scientific connection because those symptoms and radio frequency exposure. So evaluating all of this evidence together, of course, is difficult. And a mistake often made by non-scientists is to give an ordinate weight to one study. And sometimes it's done to my study, but even I am skeptical of this. One must be skeptical of one study. Things have to be confirmed in other studies. So an ordinate weight is given to a positive study or to one result or another. So one needs a balanced weight of the evidence approach, and it's called risk assessment, and that's what IARC does. And that's what other organizations do, where you weigh all the evidence, and the biggest weight is given, as I said, to epidemiology, but you also look at the relevance of the studies, you look at quality of the study, of potential for bias, and so on and so forth. And that's how you come up with evaluating the total evidence. And that kind of evaluation is, the consensus of most scientists is right now that it's possibly carcinogenic or 2B. So it's the weakest classification of possible classifications of carcinogenicity. So the Federal Communication Commission produces exposure limits, and the exposure limit, as you could see on this graph, depend on the frequency. And the occupational exposures are allowed to be 5 times higher. And what's considered is an occupational exposure if a person who is exposed gets training and he is aware of his environment, is aware of risk, and then the exposure is allowed to be 5 times higher. So for general population, you could see in the frequency we're talking about, the limit is about 0.6 microwatts per square centimeters. So the thermal effects form the basis of the guidelines. And as I mentioned in my report, that while there are non-thermal effects, they are not considered to be sufficiently strong to form the basis of the guidelines. And that's where the research is a non-thermal effect. Are they real? Do they exist? What are the limits? So that's the kind of research that's ongoing. So there is some indication of risk, and this is what's led to IARC 2B classification. But overall, there is no consistent indication of risk, and with important uncertainties. And we need to be aware that this research is ongoing, and there is an NTP study that has been brought up several times, and also not a lot of different outcomes or diseases have not been studied. So that's where the RF research is. Now I'm turning to the smart meters, which is what to keep in mind, that the exposure levels are very, very low. So even if the effects turn out to be true at the higher level, it does not mean that they will be true at low level. And so, basically, it's mobile phone. The exposure of the smart meter is about the same level, roughly, as of mobile phone. And mobile phone, you keep close to your head. and the smart meter is far away, plus smart meter operates for a very small percentage of time. So you only operate for a few minutes per day maximum, but usually much less. So it's kind of, I mean, it depends on the kind of meter, so I'm very hesitant of doing those comparisons, so I'm giving you a big picture. There could be exceptions in different situations, but overall, think of a smart meter as a cell phone that's in the ground somewhere, and it's transmitting, it's talking to the station once in a while. It doesn't do this all the time, like I do on my phone.
Doctor, when you were considering AMI, did you take into consideration the cumulative effect? Say if a customer or ratepayer in Montgomery County is already exposed to a utility that is employing the use of AMI, and then if they would be exposed, if WSSC would then employ the use of AMI, did you consider the cumulative effect of that?
So let me just go on a little bit more, but basically each one of those is about 1% or less of the total allowable, so there's no way for me to really consider all the effects of people. We are getting more and more exposure all the time. The use is just going very, I mean, in our homes, in our car, with the mobile phones, with laptops, and so on and so forth. So, but in terms of the meters, each, so there might be like 3 meters on the house, like electric meter, gas meter, and a water meter, right? And so if they are communicating, few seconds once in a while, it's very unlikely they will be communicating at the same time, first of all. And each one of them, they are like way below 1% of total permissible exposure, so they won't get to the very high level. So in my report, there was a group that under their imagined worst scenario, they tried to figure out what would be the worst percent, and it was still very, very low. That's not to say that the exposure tomorrow is going to be very different, because there are going to be thousands of other users. I mean, these frequencies are very valuable, and we get more and more exposure every day. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So just to say, the smart meters, they could be gas or electric or water. They use low power transmitters to communicate with access points and when necessary to other meters. Like the electric meters could actually communicate a lot more, because sometimes they are in a mesh network, so they communicate with each other all the time. My understanding is that water meters are not put in such network, and they only communicate mostly to the access point. So exposure, I mean, when you think of the smart meter exposure, think of 3 things. One is power. How powerful is the transmitter? Then the distance, how close you are. I mean, the distance is your friend, because the exposure falls very rapidly, square with the distance. So you could see on this graph, for example, the exposures like at 1 foot, you cannot measure next to, people sometimes measure very close to the meter, but you have to be, you cannot measure very close. You need to really know what you're doing. So you need to be like 1 foot away. So at 1 foot away, you can see the exposures, and then you see how quickly they fall off with the distance. So if you see like at 15 meters or even before, it really, really goes down. And this is, again, this is the electric meters, because I haven't found any studies that measured exposure to smart meters, but a few studies, and all the studies that I found, I enumerate in my report. Some are abroad, some are in the US. This is an example of 6 California residences, and at the very, very venue, very, very, very close to the meter, it's like 14%. This is a sort of a worse scenario that it's like 14.7% of maximum level. And then the other thing that you need to remember is the length of use or transmission. So when you are on your phone, talking or texting, you know, or even if you're not, the phone constantly communicates with the base station. It needs to know where you are. The base station needs to know. So your phone, even if you're not using it, but it's on, right? It pings not all the time to the base station. I'm here, and then if you move, it finds another, you know, base station and starts communicating it to that base station. So here are just some examples, exactly, just to give you sort of a perspective of the power of the source of the source of the exposure, but it doesn't take into consideration how close you are or how far, how often it communicates. Just gives you kind of a basic idea. You see there on the very right the cellular telephone base station, or something that tries to be, that looks like a palm tree, but tries to be a cellular telephone base station. You know, the wattage there is 40 watts, but it's located closer to the people than, for example, the amateur radio or FM radio broadcast, which is 30,000 watts, but a lot of people are not so close to it, right? So, so it gives you kind of a perspective of different exposure. The weather radar is, you know, the source is very powerful. You could see walkie-talkie, you could see microwave relay. It's lower, it's, you know, surprisingly low exposure because they operate only at the line of sight. So you don't have to use such big power. You could see a smart meter, which is at 1 or 2 watts. You can see a cellular phone, and you can see a baby monitor. Again, these are sort of representative values. There could be probably examples that differ from that. Doesn't cover the universe, but gives you a common, usual level of exposure. I also, in the report, talk a lot about different studies of smart meters. These are electric meters, and the studies are based on in the laboratory. That's the first picture. It also been measured when there is a bank of meter, like it could be with electric smart meters. So even though there hasn't been a lot of information on the water exposure, based on all the consideration, exposures from electric smart meters should be higher than from the water smart meter, because they communicate a lot more information, and that's the way I design. So to summarize, about smart meters, the maximum power is 1 to 2 watt, transmits for very short periods, usually fraction of a second, not immediately next to human body, exposure generally far below cell phones, Wi-Fi, and microwave ovens, and well below the safety standards by the FCC. And I just wanted to leave you with some what I consider reliable sources, such as World Health Organization, Environmental Defense Fund, California Council on Science and Technology, that produced a large report on smart meters in 2011, and National Cancer Institute. Thank you.
So, Doctor, you talked about the proximity of the meters. Would it make a difference to you if a meter was located in the ratepayer's home as opposed to out by the curb?
So my understanding is that the meter that's located at home, that the source, the RF, something that will produce the exposure, will be actually located outside the home.
Okay.
So that's number one. But of course, like I said, distance makes a huge difference. So the further you are from the meter, the fields will fall off very quickly. But it probably fall off to the background within a few meters, 10, 15 meters, like I said.
What about the vulnerability of the population exposed to the radio frequency? So, for example, if you have an older person that happens to be predisposed to some other illnesses, would that be a consideration in addition to the power, the proximity, and the duration of the transmission?
So I actually am the one who published one of the first major reviews that's often quoted on sensitivity of children to radio frequency fields. So I think there are reasons to think that children might be more susceptible and more exposed for a variety of reasons, but not as related to smart meters. I mean, it's related to mobile phone exposure. That would be where my focus would be. For elderly, I mean, in general, elderly are considered to be more vulnerable. I'm not aware of links really to stuff, but I mean, like I said, things like Alzheimer's and other diseases of the elderly haven't been looked at in a great detail. So in general, elderly are considered vulnerable, but my focus would be on children.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
I'd just like to follow up with Damien. So in regards to the percentage of meters that are inside of the home, what is that percentage for WSSC customers?
64% are inside, 36 are outside.
I had a question for the doctor. Could you please speak to your view of the health and adverse effect of the radio frequency radiation emitted by smart meters? I know in your study, or one of the studies, it said that it was a low possibility in the ranking, but how would you summarize the impact, the health impact of the smart meter?
So I think this, you know, when we did a study in Europe, for example, where we looked at various sources of exposure to children, to a variety of sources, and smart meters didn't even register. So the kids were wearing the meters, and we were trying to see.
U.S. studies?
No, the U.S. There's very little research done in the U.S. on the subject. I mean, aside from I've been funded to do one study which ended long ago, and then the National Toxicology Program put a lot of money into the study that was mentioned as well. But in terms of the U.S. studies on RF, there are very few studies.
So the studies you've done, you would say that there's little to no adverse impact on the health of a person's using or utilizing smart meters.
So there are two separate questions, right? One is, could RF exposure have health effects?
Yeah.
My opinion is the question is open. We don't have a strong evidence and something to worry about, but we haven't studied a lot, and there are some indications of risk that we need to follow up. So that's my opinion about potential for radio frequency exposure. For smart meters, I don't think it's a concern, not because of what I said before, but because the exposure is so low. So it's like, you know, the cigarettes, you know, if you smoke, are very, very bad for you, cause many, many diseases. If it's a secondhand smoke, it's still, you know, is a lot. But if it's, you know, somebody who is smoking, you know, far away from your house, I mean, that's just not where exposure is. That's the main thing, is that the smart meters just don't produce exposure.
The second question I have is on the FCC standards. I had asked the young lady earlier about what the FCC standards are, how dated are they, and likely, because it just seems like a lot of the information, like you said, isn't there, or it's very dated, 2006, 14 years ago, 2005. And so just the FCC standards, so they were put in place when, and are they in the process of being updated?
So the standard is from 1996. And in 2013, they opened an inquiry, and they received a lot of comments. And I've seen stuff, people thinking they're not going to change the standards, but the inquiry, as far as I know, I tried to find out for this report, and as far as I could tell, the inquiry hasn't been closed. So they haven't produced anything.
Okay, so are the comments, do you know, on the public website of the FCC? Do you know the ones that they received?
I think that they collected. I don't know that you can. I know people send a lot of public comments to FCC. There was a big internet drive to send comments to FCC, so I've seen that, and I am sure a lot of people send comments to FCC, but they have not come up with a new. The ICNIRP, which is another organization, and the international organization, they have they have updated and their guidelines. I mean, they're not limits. They're like guidelines because they don't have an authority like FCC does, and so each country can adopt or not adopt. But they have a more recent guidelines that are similar. They differ a little bit by different, subjects, like how much they average over what time period of what part of the body and tissue, but the level is about the same, and the smart meters would be way, way, way below those limits.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Keifetz. You have a tremendously impressive background.
Thank you.
And I see where you studied mathematics at the old USSR.
That's right.
And,
So I know about all Soviet studies, and I know how unreliable they
Sovietsky
are.
Soyuz, yeah.
That's
Очень
right.
хорошо. And with Hebrew University in Belgium and France and all over. You were here to hear some of the testimony from citizens in opposition. And you heard some of the references to you and your background, basically suggesting that you're a front for the industry, so we should discount what you say. Would you care to respond to that or any of the particular comments that were made about you personally during a previous testimony?
I find them extremely offensive. I think my research stands for itself. Like I said, I publish both positive and negative studies. I just go where the data is. I'm not driven by, external pressure or funding or anything like that. And I have studies, I pioneered studies on mobile phones, and I've done studies on childhood leukemia that have been mentioned. And and like I said, my studies are referenced by all the reviews. So I think they are considered to be state of the art. So that's all I can say.
Thank
I mean, I don't know why they think I do stuff for wireless industry, but it's okay. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I do or not. I don't think it's relevant.
From a cybersecurity standpoint, is there an additional vulnerability?
This is really outside. This is really outside my area of expertise. I don't. I focus on health effects. I don't know about cybersecurity, and I think somebody else should be answering that question.
Okay, thank you very much.
I can give my opinion, but I'm not.
Well, what is your opinion? You're an expert generally.
Well, no, I'm an expert on health
Does it
effects.
concern you just as a citizen then? Do you think that is...
I'm concerned about cybersecurity in general. I'm not sure how important smart meters are. I mean, I think that, I'm concerned about cybersecurity and, identity theft and all of that's going on. But I don't know whether, how smart meters particularly can be used. I mean, cybersecurity be an issue in self-driving cars, and there are lots of issues with cybersecurity. I don't know if this one is the one that has high priority, but this is just my personal opinion.
Whenever local government has a hearing or an intent to put up a cell phone tower or a cell tower over a tunnel for whatever reason, there's always a lot of opposition for many different reasons, some of which the same reasons that we've heard today. Are you aware of any follow-up studies on health effects where those cell towers have been put up? Is there a higher incidence of anything for an appreciable amount of time after the cell towers went up?
So there haven't been a lot of studies, and not a lot of good studies. So the studies that have been done do not indicate big problems. But I think the studies have been very few in between and very problematic in design. They had many different issues. So there are a few studies. They generally do not find effect. But I think that they also have problems. And in general, there hasn't been. I mean, it sounds silly. I'm a researcher. I'm asking for more research. But since you are asking, this really is pathetic, I think, how little research is being done because there is so much exposure. We're all exposed, and very, very little research is done, especially in this country.
I guess putting on sunblock regularly would be a way to cut down on radiation.
to sunlight.
Yeah, right, exactly. The natural radiation.
Not to, I mean, again, you have to be very specific. You're talking about, certain type of sunlight that causes skin cancer. It's a very specific frequency. Ionizing radiation is when you get X-rays or, CT scans and stuff like that. So it's very specific. It's like huge differences in exposure as you go through different frequencies. So you have to be very specific about what frequency you're talking about.
Okay, thank you.
I would just concur with my colleague that your credentials are certainly outstanding, and I wanted to thank you for coming to present to us today. But you said, in answering Commissioner Dennis's question, that certainly more research is needed in this field, and that in the United States we've not done that. For the individuals who spoke this morning and presented our testimony that was really in opposition to the installation of AMI, what would they pick out in your report as being a major weakness?
I don't know. I mean, I've seen some of the emails. I don't know. I mean, I think some of the people talked also about 5G, which is a different thing. I mean, it's just totally different thing. So this is a different, would be a different exposure once it's implemented. I haven't seen anything in what has been brought up that I missed, I mean, people have brought up surveys. They haven't been published. There's not enough information on methods. They need to be thoroughly reviewed, and if they need to be published, so they are available to people. The one that I found has very, very major weaknesses. I discuss it in my report. They talk about bioinitiative report. I don't reference specifically, but I mention it in my report. Everything that they brought up, I've discussed in my report. I talk about IARC. I talk about NTP study. I haven't really heard anything that I haven't considered.
All right, well, if there are no more questions, as my colleagues have already said, we thank you so much for coming here today and shedding some light on this very important topic for us.
Thank you. I know it's very, very confusing. I mean, part of this whole area is that there are many, many people with different disciplines working in the area, and they all, have seen a piece of it, and it's very, very complex, everything. So it's very easy to confuse situations and talk about other exposures and some studies that haven't been published or haven't been integrated into the literature. So I'd be glad to, answer further questions if you so need. So.
Yeah, confusing, but genuinely concerning for folks.
So
And,
I mean, again, I think with smart meters, it's the exposures are so low that I think concern is unwarranted.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, and have a safe trip.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Dr. Heifetz. Commissioners, to reiterate Dr. Heifetz's findings, the RF exposures from smart meters are neither long or strong enough to approach safety standards set by FCC and other bodies. The meter only transmits milliseconds per day. In 1 year, this amounts to approximately a 2-minute cell phone call. So moving forward, we will continue our extensive outreach and continue to explore opt-out options to be presented in May. Then tentatively, in July, we will present for approval by the commissioners the contract to implement AMI with the goal to start system integrations in September 2020, initial deployment in April 21, and full deployment by October 24. With that being said, I'd like to thank you, and do you have any questions?
Yeah, I just want to follow up, Damien, on, make sure I heard you correctly. So we're going to be voting,
No.
in what month did you say we're going to be voting on this on? Or
So
you
our
understand?
intent is to bring the contract forward in
Contract,
July.
in July.
Correct.
So the vote on the contract, I guess, would be a de facto vote for thumbs up or thumbs down on AMI.
It would be a vote for the procurement of AMI, correct?
Procurement.
Right.
And it's a little unclear to me the extent to which we may already, or previous commissioners may already have approved going in this direction with the CIP and items in the CIP. So, but I would assume by what you just said that whatever has occurred is not deemed to be approval of AMI per se, that the approval or rejection of AMI would be on the motion to adopt the contract or to approve the contract. Is that correct? If I have that correct?
Yes, the motion to approve the award of funding for the contract for AMI will be in July.
Okay. And at what point, or is it at that point that we get into the opt-in or opt-out?
So,
As a motion to the contract, or would that have to be a separate motion, or that would be first?
so in May, we'll talk about the opt-out provisions, but in July, we will actually move forward with the contract.
So in May, there will be a discussion and a vote as to whether it's opt-in or opt-out, and if it's opt-out, whether or not there's any price to be paid for it or something of that nature. Is that right?
So our intention in May is to present the options for opt-out, to educate you on the 3 or 4 different options being proposed. So that is the intent in May.
So, and we will be voting on that, on the opt-in or opt-out in May then? Is that, no?
No.
At what point do we vote on opt-in or opt-out?
Right now, we want to make sure we educate you guys before we move anything to a vote. So that hasn't been decided yet, but we definitely want to educate you in May on the options.
So would we have to initiate a motion on opting out? Because otherwise the assumption would be that you're just in without any opt-out option.
I'm not sure what the statute says as far as what your role and responsibility would be for that decision, but I know what we'll do in May is present it to you.
Okay, well, I would suggest that I personally think it's very important and more than appropriate. I think it's really essential that commissioners at some point vote on whether it's opt-in or opt-out and what conditions there might be. As important as it is, I think, to vote on the approval of the contract itself, which is the de facto approval or rejection of AMI. That's just my view of it.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I would just follow up, since you are going to be presenting us with information on the opt-out options, I think it would be helpful for commissioners if during that discussion you just kind of presented something which basically said, here's the feasibility of doing opt-out. Explain to us how you'd manage the system, if opt-out, did go forward. And how would we minimize the impact of opt-out on WSSC operations? I just think that those would be some helpful things to include in your discussion.
Yes, Madam Vice.
And just again, I mean, in the material that you gave us, there's an analysis of other utilities around the country that have opt-in or opt-out provisions and the circumstances of that. So I would assume that it's highly relevant for us, for one reason, because it's there in the material that you provided.
Yes, and we'll get into that in May, all the different utilities that do have opt-out provisions, that don't have opt-out provisions, so the decision points around those opt-outs. So we'll get into that and what those fees are, and I'll definitely bring that to you in May.
And just one last point on, because the CIP, this is moving forward because this was in the CIP, I think it's 2011, 2012, or 2013, one or all of those years that there was an amendment to the CIP or an element of the CIP, the Capital Improvements Program, that provided for movement in this direction towards exploring AMI. So
Exploring and implementing are two different
different
things. Like, I
things.
think they got approval to hire a contract or a consultant,
Right.
which they have in place. And then the next step, I think, is after the May discussion on opt-in, opt-out, the July discussion, to me, seems like it would be a recommendation with, here's the contract and here are opt-in, opt-out considerations. But I guess my question is a little bit different. In the communication activities to date, I was wondering if you had done any stakeholder outreach, and when I say stakeholder, I mean ratepayer. We have received a number of emails, and I know at least the Prince George's County budget hearing, the questions weren't necessarily about the budget, but they were about AMI. A couple people came to speak, and I was wondering if there was a plan to do some stakeholder, like ratepayer stakeholder outreach, just to increase awareness in the both communities about what is coming, so that we get a very fulsome and holistic and informed ratepayer as the commissioners are making this decision.
So, Commissioner Thompson, yes, thus far, we've had several open houses over the past years where we've talked about, and we had booths to talk about AMI. We've reached out to our community feedback group and gotten feedback from them and did a survey around AMI. So we've done some community outreach. We'll continue to do that as we move forward. We do have plans in the comprehensive communication plan to have community outreach events, to have these town hall events where we'll speak more about opting out. I'm sorry, about AMI.
Okay.
You got me.
No, as we get closer to the vote, I think the more information ratepayers have on this very important issue, because people have an opinion one way or another, I think it could be very helpful for us as we make informed decisions to make sure that ratepayers know what the issue is, what the pros and cons are for all the different alternatives that are posed.
I understand, Carla.
Just to add to what Damien said, just as we did the rate structure outreaches was specifically on that topic, we want to have specific AMI hearings, town halls, whatever we call it, just on that topic, because some of what we've done, the first thing that Damien mentioned was the other open houses that we've done where it's been like one of many topics. So we're just going to single in on AMI.
Yep.
But that would be after everything is set. We've approved procurement.
No, that's going to come before,
Okay.
so that you have the benefit of that information as well.
And I really appreciate that, because I think when we did that in regards to the rates, we got a lot of input from citizens. I think both at the Prince George's as well as the Montgomery County hearings, folks showed up and came out and gave their opinions that had never been to a public hearing before. And I think as commissioners, we need that level of comfort to get a broad section of how our ratepayers feel.
Additionally, as I mentioned in my presentation, we set up, an email address as well when you visit the website. If there are any issues, concerns, or questions, an FAQ sheet, and we've responded to customers on the emails that we've received. In fact, we invited them to view the study online. So we have been proactive in that manner as well.
I think that's,
Well, no, I was just going to say, making clear the question that I asked. So when is all of that going to take place based on the schedule you just laid out for May and July? I'm just trying to get a...
So we have one more internal communications planning session to talk about external communications. During that time, we'll overlay the communication plan with the project plan and make sure the timeline aligns with the project plan. So all the things that are centered around communication, it all impact as the schedule allows and permits.
Like when? We're pretty much in March, so I'm trying to figure out when all of that's going to take place. That's why I asked that question. So I'm looking at the timetable going, if we're going to do everything we did with the rate structure, that was a lot, and it was over pretty extensive period of time, so I'm just trying to get the timetable down.
And we'll have to confer as a group on the timetable. We don't have that today, but I know it's a very short window. Even if we have to push the procurement back, we're definitely going to educate our customers if we have to push the procurement back.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
And if you could coordinate that with commissioners' schedules, because I'm sure we all want to be at the hearings for our respective counties, that would be appreciated.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to publicly congratulate CEO Reed and Mr. Lampley on having this report done by Dr. Heifetz. I think it was very important. It certainly was illuminating. And I think it shows that WSSC is very dedicated to transparency and accountability in implementing new technology. I think it's important to be innovative and at the same time be transparent and accountable to the ratepayers. So congratulations on that. And I'm sure we'll continue to see that as we move through this process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. I think it's a great comment. I fully agree with it, and I think it's also great to compare this to the rate structure, which was a lot of work, but I think it's proven to be worth it. Absolutely, and just as we may have started this process, or previous commissioners started it with an amendment or an item in the CIP, you could obviously have an amendment to take something out of the CIP if it were the will of the commissioners to do so. But again, I just think it's important for the public and the ratepayers and everyone concerned that we vote on this one way or the other, up or down. Likewise with the possible element of the opt-in or opt-out.
And before I leave, if you can see over here to the left, I have a display of the many types of meters that we have currently in our inventory. And just wanted to share that with you real quick. And the reason why I share that, because one of the things I want to talk about is that the meter that exists today is the same meter that's going to exist in the future in the home. So if you see that, and it's retrofitted with a register, as well as a radio that's going to be tied to the cap, which transmits the read. And that cap is either outside or mounted on the outside of the home. So that kind of shows you in a display of how the meter assembly is proposed. So
you're saying that the AMI is going to be fitted right on to the meter itself?
So if you look right here, the gray top on the meter.
I'm David Carpenter. I'm a public health physician. I graduated from Harvard Medical School, and I worked for the New York State Department of Health for 18 years. During that period of time, I was responsible for administering a program in electromagnetic fields. I subsequently became the Dean of the School of Public Health, and presently I'm a faculty member in the School of Public Health and the Director of the Institute for Health and the Environment at the University of Albany.
Thank you. And Central Maine Power says there is no reason to be concerned about smart meters. There are no health effects, and everyone who's worried about health effects of RF from smart meters or from the mesh network really has nothing to be concerned about. And what do you say to that?
I said that's absolutely false. The question to ask them is, what is the evidence that smart meters are safe and have no adverse health effects? And the answer to that question is that there is no such evidence. And in fact, while no one has actually done human health studies in relation to people living in homes with smart meters, we have evidence from a whole variety of other sources of radio frequency exposure that demonstrates convincingly and consistently that exposure to radio frequency radiation at elevated levels for long periods of time increases the risk of cancer, increases the damage to the nervous system, causes electrosensitivity, has adverse reproductive effects, and a variety of other effects on different organ systems. So there is no reason for no justification for the statement that smart meters have no adverse health effects.